You are listening to the Visualising War and Peace podcast. With the help of a wide range of guests, we examine how war and peace are experienced in different periods and places, and we discuss the world-building impact which representations of conflict and its aftermath can have on us as individuals and societies. Hello, my name is Alice König, and I direct the Visualising War and Peace project at the University of St Andrews. My guests today are Professor Konstantinos Nikoloutsos, who is based at St Joseph's University in Philadelphia, and Professor Lee Brice from Western Illinois University. Konstantinos' research focuses particularly on the afterlife of ancient Greece and Rome in the Western world, and a number of his publications examine the representation of ancient history on stage and screen. Lee is a military historian, focusing especially on military unrest and indiscipline during the time of Alexander the Great and in the early Roman Empire. He has recently contributed a reflective conclusion to an excellent collection of essays which Konstantinos has masterminded, published in 2023 as Brill's companion to ancient Greek and Roman warfare on film. So I'm looking forward today to picking their brains about the ways in which ancient warfare gets depicted in modern cinema, and to diving into some of the insights offered by Konstantinos' edited volume. Konstantinos and Lee, thank you very much for making time to talk to me, and welcome to the Visualising War and Peace podcast.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about a project I had tremendous pleasure working on.
Excellent. I'm really looking forward to it. So let's get stuck in right away. Konstantinos, in the introduction to your edited volume, you write, "Celluloid antiquity is saturated with images of combat." And you make the point that it's really virtually impossible to find a film set in antiquity that doesn't contain at least some war fighting. I wonder if you can tell us why you think that's the case. Why do films that bring the ancient world to life feature war so often?
This is one of those questions that resist a straightforward answer. One reason is to be found in the ordinariness of warfare in antiquity itself, in the very fact that armed conflict was a catalyst for geopolitical changes in ancient times. Warfare shaped the ancient Mediterranean world, and warfare is ubiquitous in what we call material culture, in what we nowadays look at in order to make sense of the ancient world. Anywhere from the friezes and pediments of ancient temples in Greece and Sicily to reliefs adorning arches, triumphal arches in the Roman Forum, and from drinking cups and storage vessels manufactured in Attica to floor mosaics and wall frescoes found at Pompeii, combat scenes were on display everywhere in both the public and private sphere in antiquity. And their ubiquity suggests that warfare was an inevitable reality in antiquity, that it was ingrained in the ancient social fabric. A second reason has to do with the reception of the Greco-Roman world in modern popular culture before cinema, such as theater, painting, and the novel. Films set in Greece and Rome do not always derive their inspiration directly or exclusively from ancient sources. They're often receptions of receptions. That is, they're based partly or wholly on popular reimaginings of the classical past, on the modern stage, page, canvas, and of course, cinema itself. So these receptions, these mediating texts, have played a major role in cementing a perception of Greece and Rome as societies in which life revolved constantly around warfare and conquests. And a third reason why war is such an important central thematic pillar in celluloid antiquity has to do with the importance of warfare in the contemporary world. War did not just shape the ancient world, it has transformed our own world. It has had a profound impact on the history of the 20th and 21st centuries. The fact that it is timeless, that allows cinema to use the past as a critical lens through which to look at the present, and encourages viewers to draw analogies and parallels between antiquity and modernity.
Thank you. You set out three really clear reasons there. And Lee, if I may turn to you. So Konstantinos has just identified some very serious reasons why war is ubiquitous in celluloid antiquity, one being the sort of its timeless nature and the fact that we turn to antiquity sometimes to make sense of the present. But of course, there's also an element of entertainment and enjoyment. And we know that war films do very well at the box office. And I wonder if you can say a little bit more about why you think that ancient warfare has this enduring entertainment appeal in film.
Well, I think probably the two parts of that are first, they're good stories. Some of these stories, like Ben-Hur, come down to us from not directly from the Bible. That was a fictional novel, many people forget, but it's a good story. It's a man trying to find his way in a difficult time, and people identify with that. And it's just simply a well-constructed story. Same thing for Gladiator, same thing for Spartacus. These are stories of people who are trying to deal with difficult times. And the way the story is constructed from beginning to end, it flows nicely, it's easy to follow, it's well edited. And so that by itself is entertaining. Another feature that's going on, of course, is star power in these films. You've got Richard Burton and Alexander the Great. You've got Kirk Douglas and Spartacus. You've got Charlton Heston and Ben-Hur. You've got Brad Pitt in the film Troy and Eric Bana in Troy. And then you come up to a movie that's more recent. Dwayne Johnson is in Hercules. And these are all men who are star-powered lead men. But you also have star-powered lead women, too. You've got Elizabeth Taylor in Cleopatra. Spartacus, you've got Gene Simmons as the parallel to Spartacus. And so you have this star power there for the male and female characters. And that, of course, is going to drive people to the box office. Russell Crowe, when he made Gladiator, he was a commodity almost. And plus, characters like Russell Crowe and to a lesser extent Richard Burton, to a lesser extent Dwayne Johnson, but they remind people of every man, particularly Dwayne Johnson and Russell Crowe in those two films. They simply remind both men and women who are watching these films, that could have been me. Maybe not as muscle built as Dwayne Johnson, but they come across as people you can relate to.
Thank you. So there's something about a sort of a really good story grammar, a good story architecture, and then this sense in which we've got ancient and modern stars to whom we might relate, and they're very much sort of central to the enjoyment element, the attractiveness of these films. We might come back in a bit to the storytelling and the way in which the power of a good film story perhaps collides sometimes with the accuracy of an ancient history. But I wonder if, Konstantinos, you can talk us through some of the aspects of ancient warfare that are most regularly represented on the big screen, bearing in mind what we've just heard about the need for a good story, a story that's going to sell. There are presumably some bits of ancient warfare that are more visible in celluloid antiquity than other bits.
In answering this question, we need to bear in mind an important distinction, that between mainstream cinema, the aspects of ancient warfare most regularly depicted on the big screen, by which I mean mainstream cinema, are those that provide the basis for grand spectacle and cater to the viewer's craving for action, namely pitched battles, clashes of vast armies on an open field, sieges breaking through the impregnable walls of iconic ancient cities, and face-to-face combat, when the camera focuses on the agonizing fighting of the protagonist with an enemy who is often cast as a villain. So why are combat scenes so important for mainstream cinema? For two reasons. First, they are projected as an index of the film's fidelity to ancient sources. In other words, they make the recreation of the classical past more truthful, more credible. They give spectators the impression, the illusion, I would say, that they can relive, they can re-experience battles the way they happened from the comfort of their cinema seat. Another reason is that they are often used as vehicles for studios and directors to launch and test new technologies in an attempt to surpass their predecessors and antagonists in the industry. And this is why battle scenes feature so prominently in the promotional campaign. Now, mainstream cinema often suppresses those aspects of ancient warfare that are less heroic and therefore less spectacular. For example, soldiers in antiquity did not fight on a daily basis. They spent more time on the camp than on the battlefield. Yet the ordinary details of camp life, cooking, cleaning, endless training, or being bored because you have nothing to do, such details are far less exciting than pitched battles and therefore receive less attention in the medium. Of course, this is not to argue that there are no films that do not focus on this aspect of ancient warfare. There are scenes in Spartacus, Troy, 300, for example. However, in such productions, the camp functions primarily as a stage for developing the film's ideological agenda before it is contested on the battlefield, rather than as a setting that conveys the monotony and tedium of everyday military life. Another aspect that has been historically suppressed in mainstream cinema, but receives more attention in auteur cinema, is the horrors and atrocities of war, the trauma, physical and psychological, inflicted on combatants and civilians alike. Since what mainstream cinema is mostly interested in heroic engagement, tends to glorify war, the focus is more on action than on its aftermath. Just offer a couple of examples to show you the difference between mainstream cinema and independent filmmakers. There are films such as The Trojan Women, released in 1971, and Iphigenia, released in 1977, made by Michael Kakoyannis, an independent European director, which focus on the conditions of camp life and the treatment of hostages. These are themes that are not treated as equally in mainstream cinema.
Thank you. So there's this illusion of fidelity because we're plunged into a battle scene where we see realistic looking ancient armor, realistic looking cavalry displays, and so on. But that is very much an illusion because there is a sort of distortion of the realities of warfare as we understand it as a holistic phenomenon, not just war as battle. So thank you for talking us through that. And actually that leads me to a question for Lee about the evolution of cinematic representations of ancient warfare over time. As I understand it, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a bit of a battle over realism and idealism on the screen. And this might touch on what Konstantinos has just said about the sort of the extent to which horrors or atrocities or gore or blood were visible or not in early cinema. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about that, about early cinema's representation of ancient warfare and how you would characterize that.
Probably the best way to think about it is warfare in cinema in the ancient world battles echoed what's going on in combat on cinema in other venues. So, for example, if you look at the 300 Spartans, 1962, I believe, if you look at that, you see the Persians and you see the Greeks, and they fight, they throw spears, there's arrows going back and forth. You could actually take that same scene and put it in a Western, change the two sides, looks exactly the same. And the same thing about a film that was made at the same time about early Christianity or the Vikings. You see the same kind of fighting, same kind of weapons, and that's part of the choreography of the period. Also, the second thing that you notice about combat in the 50s and 60s is that it is simpler. It's not simple, I'm not saying that. It's just simpler than what you see in, say, 300, for example, or the remaking of Ben-Hur or Gladiator. You have in the movie Spartacus, if you watch it carefully, you'll notice that although there are at least 4 battles that occur in the film, you actually only see one, which is excellent filmmaking to suggest to the audience there was a battle and here was the outcome. But that one battle that you see where Spartacus is taking on the Roman army, you have fire, you have lots of soldiers. It's a complicated bit of choreography to do, but if you watch it, It doesn't look anything like what Russell Crowe and his buddies are doing. But another humongous difference, and Hannah Marie Tridwick brings this out in the book very nicely, is the scale of violence that comes out. And that's a huge difference because in the 50s and 60s, you have two forces going on. One is you've had World War II, and pretty much every family that's going to see this, even if no one in the family was in the war as a combatant, they have family members who were impacted by what was going on in World War II. And there's familial trauma. They may not want to recognize it or identify it. And society knows that. So they're not going to push the boundaries excessively in terms of gore and warfare violence. In the major battle scene in Spartacus, you see lots of stabs going on. There's not much blood. One guy takes the Roman gladius in the head, almost no blood, and you don't even see him get hit. He just stands up in front of this. He's got a gladius sticking out of both sides of his head. Another guy loses his leg in a battle scene. None of that is particularly anything compared to what we see now, and we can thank the movie Gladiator for that. When Gladiator came out, it completely changed the way violence was portrayed in battles. And since then, there is this sense that the more violent it is, the more historically accurate it is. And yet the other force that I mentioned that's affecting films of the 1950s are the censors. The censors are tweaking the level of violence for the sake of society, for the sake of advertising, for the sake of marketing, because who wants to go see in the 1950s and 60s? Who's going to be attracted to go see a film where there's lots of blood? The Longest Day, there's only one guy who actually shows any blood at all, and it's one drop on his forehead. So, and you see that kind of thing in Spartacus, you see that in Ben-Hur. It's a whole different world between then and now. But if you look at Gladiator, if you look at especially 300, which is just right off the scale, and to be fair to 300, which I don't like being, but if you're fair to 300, you have to recognize it was intended as art. It wasn't intended as art is its primary reason for coming. So of course they're going to go over the top, but in what Zack Snyder thought was an artistic way.
But you've touched on some other really interesting elements, the geopolitical context, actually sort of personal trauma potentially in the background of multiple families who've gone through World War II. And that's really, really interesting to think about the choices that are made about the representation of violence or the description of violence rather than the visual demonstration of it graphically on a 1950s or 1960s cinematic screen. So that's really useful to hear about that earlier stage. And then Konstantinos, I wonder if you can talk us through some of the changes that have developed over time. Lee's already pointed to Gladiator as perhaps a watershed moment in the representation of really dramatic, graphic violence. But can you tell us a little bit more about how representations of ancient warfare shifted over time on the screen and how that might relate to the artistic ambition of directors, as well as the sensibilities around the representation and the viewing of violence?
So some of the significant changes we see over time have to do with the number of battles included in a film, the frequency with which battle scenes are inserted in the narrative, and the amount of running time these scenes occupy individually as well as collectively. For example, all the combat scenes dramatized in the 1956 film Alexander the Great take up less than 13 minutes of its total running time, which is 2 hours and 21 minutes. By contrast, in Oliver Stone's 2004 recreation of Alexander's expedition into Asia, the Battle of Gaugamela alone extends over 3 chapters of the widescreen DVD and takes up 18 minutes, that battle alone. By contrast, the 1956 film devotes only 4 minutes to that military encounter, which is considered the peak of Alexander's expedition. So, as Lee correctly described it, the main reason why we see such a dramatic shift between earlier and more recent recreations of ancient warfare on the screen is the release of Gladiator. Ridley Scott's film constitutes a terminus post quam for recreations of ancient battles. For example, in films made in the post-World War II era, battle scenes were typically used as tools of dramatic climax or mechanisms of conflict resolution. And for this very reason, they were inserted at strategic places in the narrative, before the intermission or towards the end of the film. The 1960 Spartacus is the best example for understanding the structure of battle scenes. The first half of the film ends with the revolted slaves storming the camp of the Roman garrison and capturing its commander. And the second half of the film culminates with a pitched battle between Spartacus's men and the Roman legions under Marcus Licinius Crassus's command. This all changed when Gladiator was released. This film puts armed conflict at the forefront of the narrative, and as opposed to its generic predecessors, it starts with a long battle sequence which runs for almost 18 minutes, a battle that constitutes the culmination of Marcus Aurelius's expedition on the north frontier of the Roman Empire. What is more, as Lee correctly described it, whereas previous epic films project a rather sanitized image of the battlefield, they cast it as a space that is devoid of butchery and full of heroic action. Gladiator launches a new aesthetics and emphasizes, not to say overemphasizes, the brutality and violence of the battlefield. And although this film has been criticized for its several historical inaccuracies, it exposes modern viewers to the butchery, savagery, and cruelty in military operations, and establishes a cinematic pattern that is reproduced in a number of films released after it. Since the release of Gladiator, we have a great amount of emphasis on butchery and savagery on the battlefield. There seems to be a shift, a transition from carefully projected, regulated, monitored violence to ultra-violence on the battlefield.
Thank you. That's really interesting. As I understand it, there is kind of more mud as well as more blood in these later films. It's dirtier, it's muckier, it's grittier in some ways, as well as actually being heavily idealized in others. But you've pointed to a kind of a more profound change as well, with the foregrounding of battle, not as a moment towards the end of the narrative arc before conflict resolution, but as something that films like Gladiator open with, obviously following on from films like Saving Private Ryan, which came out a couple of years before Gladiator as well. And that seems to me to speak to a different conceptualization of war itself. As you said, not is the culmination leading to conflict resolution, but something that's more omnipresent as well as ultra-violent somehow. I wonder, Lee, if we can turn to you. Can you just speak a little bit about the way in which real-world developments perhaps affected the representation of ancient warfare on screen from the 2000s onwards?
So these films, these ancient war films that we see, whether it's Gladiator, whether it's Troy, particularly, as I said before, with 300, when these things are being filmed, there are soldiers, not just American soldiers, but soldiers in other parts of the world who are encountering violence for which they were not accustomed. If we go back and look at American history, we find that during the Reagan administration, there was the explosion that killed all the Marines in Lebanon, but there was an invasion of Grenada, but neither of those were on the scale of the first Iraq War as far as violence goes. And so by the time in 2000, when you get Gladiator coming out, that story wasn't written in 1999. It had been written years earlier. And so it, like 300, like Troy, they reflect events going on outside of them. And particularly with Troy is really effective in this way, because if you watch Wolfgang Petersen, how he frames his shots, particularly there's this one shot that he has, it's a flyover of the triremes on the beach. And it's a frame for frame remake of a shot from the film Longest Day. And that's purposeful. He does that for the film buffs who are interested in that sort of thing. But it's also reminding contemporary viewers of landing on beaches, of the power of war, of the technology of war. And so he's the first director to reshoot that since The Longest Day was shot. So he's come at it in a way where he's kind of made modern war look ancient in a way. Same thing for all the ships he shows. He shows all these ships approaching in a fleet that reminds us of D-Day, reminds us of other significant naval engagements from World War II and from the Korean War for that matter. So you do get these modern instances of the violence doesn't exist in a vacuum. Is it a more violent world? Yeah, the guns of Vietnam, which was a violent war. Let's not sugarcoat that. The films you see in that period, yes, there's violence, but it's almost cartoonish in some of those films. And yet here you come up and you have these other films that are written and made in the late 90s and up into the 21st century. And these are portraying a new level of violence because you have IEDs, you have all kinds of booby traps. You have, for example, in the movie King Arthur, you're actually having the Roman army taking on insurgents, not in the Spartacus way, but more in the modern warfare kind of way. Same kind of thing in the movie The Eagle, where you get a soldier who is doing much the same thing. He's in a unit where they're having to fight against insurgents. And so this is something that would have been in the mind of the audience at the time, just as earlier war would have been in the mind of the audience in that period. So I'd say, yes, you do get that sense. And then in a film like Gladiator, where you're seeing the power of the Roman army as expressed in that opening battle, it does remind viewer that modern war is a humongous, overwhelming effort of capital as well as bodies. And you'd really get that sense. And you get that again in Gladiator 2, which is almost unworthy of discussion, but you do get that same sense there too. There was a very good review of Gladiator 2. They called it fantasy rather than historical fiction, which I think is fair, a fair treatment of it. But you do get that sense there that it's I hate saying this, the Roman war machine, that it is a machine, that it's almost mechanized in its force. And that's reflecting modern war.
Yeah, so you're pointing out the various ways in which the aesthetics and the representation of war fighting in these films, late 1990s, 2000s and onwards, are picking up on, tuning into and reflecting the changing nature of war itself. So you've mentioned IEDs, you've mentioned counterinsurgency as well, and the technologies, and an emphasis on the technologies and the resourcing and the overwhelming commitment of capital as well. So that's really interesting. So Lee, we focus quite a lot on the representation of war fighting, of battle, but of course war itself is a much broader phenomenon, impacting many people beyond the soldiery. And I wonder if you can just tell us, relative to war fighting, how much of ancient war's aftermath or its costs, or indeed of conflict resolution, that's not necessarily tied always to winning a battle, do we actually see on film?
Well, I've been thinking about this because peace is cool. I like peace. And unlike Tony Stark, I would not be out of a job if there were peace. But you don't see a ton of it, but you actually, I think, see more of it than you might expect, just not necessarily in the ways you expect. So, for example, Spartacus and also Russell Crowe, Gladiator, they both, and actually even Jared Butler in 300, they all find peace in death. They're all told in death here. And that gives a certain sense of, okay, this is what, as a soldier, you guys in these three films, you're going to die. Ben-Hur, it's a story about the Christ. And so no surprise, we get peace in that film, but it's brought to him by a conversion story. There's very little surprise there. And so you do get peace in that sense. Also, you get actual attempts at truce making or peace in other ways. So in the film Cleopatra, Caesar shows up at the dock in Alexandria. The Egyptians are all ready for him to cause a fight, to provoke a battle, and he instead buys his way through market to get to the king. So for those who didn't know the story, film is showing there is another way to deal with this. You don't have to go to war. In Troy, Brad Pitt's character Achilles, everybody knows when the film begins, he's going to die in battle. But in a way, that film is very much about how nice peace is. It's an anti-war film. And by the time the film ends, you don't know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. In a way, who you think the good guys are, well, maybe they are, maybe they're not. It's a complex problem. In the film King Arthur and in the film Eagle, in both films, they're about Romans fighting insurgency. And in both films, the soldiers simply are tired of war and walk away. And Anton Fuqua's King Arthur, he's constructed a situation where the lead character, Clive Owen, okay, he doesn't walk away entirely from war, but he does walk away from fighting these insurgents forever. It's just, I'm going to go ahead and stay here and become King Arthur, is the suggestion that's made. So you do get other ways of finding peace. Gladiator starts out saying there's no peace, because the very first scene we see is a peace envoy who has been sent to the barbarians, and his head comes back. And so that's your first signal. There won't be peace in this film. And that is the message that carries through the whole film, that this character will not know peace. Rome will not know peace. And so you do get it sometimes, but not nearly as much as we might like. In Spartacus, there's no sense of peace. And even when you're in Rome, there's constant discussion about, well, there's this war going on and there's opportunities there. And so peace is missing from that film too. So peace, you don't get a lot of it in any of these films. And part of that is peace isn't dramatic. That's the biggest problem peace has. There's almost no place for it on the screen unless it's serving the needs of the storytelling. Otherwise, forget it. There won't be peace.
And some of the points you've made, we've heard about the attraction of pitched battles and set piece scenes in film, but that's very much also what our ancient Greek historians like to give us, because these are the purple passages. But it's really interesting to hear you point to some of the ways in which these films, even so, whether they are glorifying war or whether they're an anti-war film, are pointing to yearning for peace, pointing to ways in which individual characters find a degree of personal peace, whether that's through dying or some other way, through walking away from conflict. And these attempts at taking another path through a truce or a negotiation, even if they don't actually take that path and the path is ultimately more fighting. Lee, you have yourself written about women's experiences of warfare in antiquity. And Konstantinos, you have also written particularly about Greek women's representation in film. So I wonder, Konstantinos, if you can tell us a bit more about how women typically appear in the films that depict ancient warfare.
Films set in the ancient world have historically been a male-dominated enterprise. They're overwhelmingly made by men and primarily addressed to a male audience. Directors are almost always male. Screenplays are written by a single male author or by a group of male authors. And the narrative perspectives are predominantly androcentric. Even when a woman occupies the central diegetic role, and the film is named after her, as is, for example, the case with Cleopatra. Her role as a military commander is often curtailed, subordinated, or denied. The representation of women in films set in the ancient world is shaped by multiple factors, including the period in which the film was produced, its genre, and whether it emerges from the Hollywood studio system or is made by an independent filmmaker. The roles that women play in films set in antiquity and revolve around warfare are polysemous and span a broad spectrum. So they appear first as wives, sisters, or daughters of eponymous male combatants. That is, they're cast as figures endowed with limited and mediated agency. Second, and this is particularly the case with more recent cinematic productions, they're depicted as warriors who lead or serve predominantly within armed forces and fight alongside men on almost equal terms. And there's a third group that includes women who are depicted as victims of armed conflict, those who bear the consequences of military violence and destruction. And to give a few examples for each category, starting with the most recent. In Michael Kakoyannis' The Trojan Women and Iphigenia, female victims of armed conflict take center stage, and their critical voice becomes an expression of their solidarity and their own primary weapon against armed men. By contrast, in films such as 300, Rise of an Empire, released in 2014, and The Legend of Tomiris, released 5 years later, female characters such as Artemisia and Tomiris reject the traditional role of women as passive victims of war And they fight face to face. They wield swords, they lead troops, and they kill other male warriors. And we have a different model in films such as Gladiator and 300, in which Lucilla and Gorgo, respectively, are cast as the perfect female counterparts to the film's male protagonists. In other words, they share the same high ethical values and try to advance the cause of their men behind closed doors. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that we're dealing with a large variety, a wide spectrum of representations. But what they have in common is that female characters included in narratives revolving around warfare are not shaped in accordance with ancient gender stereotypes, but rather in agreement with the gender stereotypes, protocols, and values of the time of their celluloid recreation, including artistic trends we see in the industries during those periods of time.
Staying with gender representation, Lee, in your conclusion to the Brill Companion to Ancient Greek and Roman Warfare on Film, which we've been talking about, you talk at one point about changing representations of masculinity as embodied by the heroes of ancient war films. And you've already touched on this when you've been thinking about the star power of both cinematic stars and these ancient stars. And I wonder if you can just give us a couple of concrete examples of how the representation of male military leaders has evolved in film history.
Well, there's two trends that we see. One is the appearance of the male body. So you get, for example, in the 1950s, you get Charlton Heston, you've got, and I'm talking about the Hollywood productions, so you get Charlton Heston, you get Kirk Douglas, and actually Richard Burton in Alexander the Great, the Richard Rosen film. They're all looking muscular, but not overly much. They look athletically muscular rather than Dwayne Johnson, who is rippling muscles. That's a whole different model of masculinity that we get with Dwayne Johnson. Russell Crowe in the middle, he's clearly a muscular, athletic kind of guy, but he's a bigger build than Charlton Heston or any of the earlier actors. Although he's looking athletic, he looks like somebody you'd hang out with on a bar stool somewhere. So he clearly knows how to handle himself. That's the look that he's given. So these masculine models of how the male body is shown change over time. You look at 300, they are clearly athletic and muscular, and that's part of the art of 300 is that they don't have six packs, they have 12 packs in their abdomen, and it's ridiculous, but it's supposed to be ridiculous. So you've got that going on too, that model of masculinity. And yet on the opposite side of the same film in 300, Xerxes is the bad guy. He's shown effeminately. He's shown as an extreme example. He's muscular, but the way he's portrayed is kind of an odd way. He doesn't come across as the same sort of manly sort of model that you get from the Spartans, and we'll come back to this, I expect, later. And then, of course, Dwayne Johnson's super muscle. So that's how the male body is shown. And in each one of these films, their promotional material shows these men with their top of their torso revealed. Kirk Douglas very much is shown this way in promotional materials. Richard Burton, same thing. Dwayne Johnson, same kind of thing. Well, everybody knows what The Rock looks like, so you do get that. But there's another category of this treatment of masculinity, and that is Charlton Heston goes through the whole film, and he looks like he could stand up for 36 hours straight. Kirk Douglas looks like he never sleeps. He's in love in the film, but it's not exactly a very emotional kind of love. And then you flash forward to modern films, and you get Russell Crowe, who has a very intense relationship portrayed in film with his family, his wife and child. The film's not afraid to portray that. In fact, it's part of what makes that character interesting to the audience. You get Dwayne Johnson, who I don't want to spend much time on this because I know that Konstantinos wants to come back and look at this, but he's had trauma. He has strong emotions that you see on the screen. The various characters in 300, they have anger issues. Pretty much most of them, but there's the one father in 300 who loses his son. That emotional outpouring in the film is touching. And it's not something you would have seen in the 50s or 60s, usually. You're not going to get that. And then in the other films that I mentioned, King Arthur and the Eagle, and even in Lost Legion, these are men who have complicated feelings, and they aren't afraid to express themselves to the female protagonists in the films. They're not afraid to share. So they're vulnerable. And that's something that you don't have in earlier films. So I would say the models of masculinity, as we would predict in culture, they do change, but they change in ways that we see in society in general, in representations on TV and in other films, as we keep coming back to.
Yeah, so as Konstantinos said about representations of women, these track changes in the contemporary norms, contemporary culture. Konstantinos, do you want to come in on the issue of male representation in celluloid antiquity?
I would like to go back to an earlier point, an earlier dichotomy between cleanliness and the dirty body of the celluloid warrior we see in films such as Gladiator. It seems that if we compare earlier to more recent films, the aesthetics of military masculinity has changed over time. In films from the 50s and 60s, the protagonist is typically portrayed as a heroic warrior who never spills a single drop of blood, even though he fights on the front line. He remains completely unaffected by the sordid conditions of the battlefield. And even if he does suffer wounds, they are epidermic, superficial, never deep enough to alter his external appearance. And they're usually confined to the peripheries of his body, such as the arms or the legs. By contrast, in the opening scene of Gladiator, Maximus falls off his horse into the mud and is saved from death thanks to the timely intervention of an anonymous cavalryman. So, as Lee correctly said, what we see in this case, and this is an aesthetics that the film launches, reproduced by several other films released in its aftermath. Whereas in previous decades, masculinity equaled heroism. The body of the celluloid warrior was treated as an untouched totem. In the case of Gladiator and its cinematic offspring, masculinity is equated with vulnerability, emotionality, as well as suffering.
Really interesting. Yeah, thinking about internal trauma, psychological trauma, as well as physical wounds. And I guess the long lasting effects of conflict, not just that momentary scratch that we might have seen in previous iterations of these films. Just thinking a little bit more about some of the men in particular that we see in these films. In one of the chapters in your edited volume, Konstantinos, a chapter by Owen Rees, we can read about the representation of ancient veterans in film. And I wonder if you can tell us a bit about how the representation of ancient veterans compares to films that depict veterans in modern times, of which there are quite a few, and perhaps the way in which maybe modern veteran experiences have been feeding into this. How have modern veteran experiences influenced cinematic representations of historic veterans?
Films set in the classical world have traditionally encouraged viewers to imagine warriors, especially those who command large armies, such as Alexander and Julius Caesar, as invincible figures who emerge triumphantly from warfare. On the celluloid battlefield, heroism prevails, and the warrior is often portrayed as a noble figure who is immune to suffering, both physical and psychological. If pain, as acknowledged, is fleeting and leaves no lasting mark. Even in Gladiator, the deep wound that Maximus sustains on his arm during his escape from his executioners disappears halfway through the film. The 2014 Hercules represents a conscious attempt to break away from this aesthetic and ideological paradigm. Hercules, the superhero in Greek myth, is not even a hero in this film. He's not motivated by high, exalted ideals, such as patriotism, as is the case with Leonidas in 300. And Leonidas was considered a descendant of Hercules in antiquity. Instead, Hercules is portrayed as a mercenary veteran, morally ambiguous, psychologically damaged, and deeply scarred by the experiences of war. So, in this film, the perspective on warfare is shifted away from that of the spectator who expects to be entertained by the violence and savagery on the screen, towards that of the one who provides the spectacle, the warrior. So this film marks a stark departure from earlier depictions of ancient warfare. We see in it a focus we see in modern veteran films, such as The Deer Hunter, The Born on the 4th of July, and The American Sniper. They focus on trauma, fractured identity, difficulty reintegrated into society, and the lingering effects of violence on the battlefield. In Hercules, warfare is not portrayed as a noble enterprise, as is the case with previous films. It is exhausting. It is corrosive. Heroism is reframed as survival rather than glory. And the film questions this traditional construction of the celluloid battlefield as a space in which aggression is always justified. Instead, it presents as a site of suffering, pain, often with permanent consequences. In this film, the ancient world becomes a vehicle for contemporary social commentary, a space in which war and its concomitants, trauma, betrayal, the treatment of veterans, can be portrayed at last and can be explored at a safe historical distance. While this film expands the thematic agenda of ancient warfare, and by doing so, it complicates the viewer identification process, because let's face it, viewers like to identify with glorious warriors, with the victors. At least it invites a more reflective mode of spectator, one that shifts attention away from heroic fantasy propagated in previous films toward the enduring and long-lasting human costs of war.
Thank you. So we're seeing really quite a journey of representation of ancient warfare on film. And it's really helpful for you to get us thinking about modes of spectatorship, viewer identification, reflective, critical viewing, and so on, as well as we do this, as we chart this journey, this evolution that you and Lee have both helped us track. And Konstantinos, in your answer then, you mentioned the way in which ancient warfare on film can become a vehicle for social commentary. And that prompts me to ask you, Lee, a little bit more about the way in which ancient warfare on film perhaps has been not only social commentary, but perhaps political commentary. We've talked already about the contact between the ancient world of the film and the modern world of its production context, and the way in which the modern world has often shaped the representation of those ancient stories. But to what extent is the ancient warfare on film sometimes used as a commentary, an intervention, even a social analysis, a political critique of modern geopolitics or modern culture? Can you think of any examples where we might see that happening?
A better question would be, can I think of any examples where that's not happening? I tend to be in the school of thought of scholars of film and history that historical films like Gladiator and many others are more about the period in which they're shot than the period in which they're set. As Konstantinos quite correctly pointed out, it brings distance between the viewer and the current events, and therefore the viewer isn't offended necessarily in these Hollywood big budget films in the way they might be if this was an openly, goes back to the beginning of filmmaking. Cecil B. DeMille was very clear about the whole purpose of the Ten Commandments, even talking before the film about how that was all about modern current politics, and he wasn't subtle. So We see this in Spartacus, for example, with the House Un-American Activities, and this whole idea of can the state quash its own citizens and its own citizens' rights just for ideological reasons that the state holds, individuals of the state hold. In Ben-Hur, you get this question of, well, what happens when the state runs into an idea like religion? How is that going to play? And then you also get a scene to really, well, in terms of ancient warfare in Troy, what I hadn't mentioned before was that Eric Bana and Brad Pitt are two of the most emotional on-screen characters. And what's interesting to see is Eric Bana's character, he's playing Hector, who we know from the Iliad, but it's very much of its time, in that he realizes this is a war he has to fight. He doesn't want to fight it. He wants to stay with his wife and he wants to protect his wife, but he knows what his duty is. He does mention this word duty, and several other characters in the film also mention the word duty. And then there's Brad Pitt, who is convinced by Brice, his captive, to adopt a more peaceful stance, to reconsider his whole attitude to war. And in fact, he dies in the end, not because he's trying to kill Trojans, although he does some of that. He dies in the end because he's chasing Briseis. He wants to find her and save her from murder at the hands of the Greeks who have invaded the city. And this is Wolfgang Petersen looking at the Iraq War and other conflicts, World War II, I already mentioned. He's looking at these and he's kind of making a commentary for us about, yeah, war, it's not as easy to understand as you think. And you look at his whole oeuvre and you see the same thing in a number of his films. Question this. And of course, this is post 9/11 that this film was made. So it's very much of that quality. Gladiator has a scene where the army returns to Rome under Joachim Phoenix. The cinematic color, the digitization has them in gray. And they come in and it's the Nuremberg rally all over again. And although Ridley Scott says in the commentary, no, I never thought that was going on, it is so obviously Nuremberg rally. And this dialogue between Rome as Nazi Germany, which happens in multiple films. There's that dialogue of a totalitarian state going on again. And we have to remember these films are designed to make money. If they offend people, then that's different. And that brings me to 300, because I can't ignore that film for this question. 300 is racist, fascist claptrap. I hate that film. In spite of all the times I've cited it in this, and I can't ignore that. And it is art, but its treatment of non-white, non-Western characters is insane.
Yes, thank you for touching on that. There are some ways in which some of these films comment critically, reflectively, perhaps push at social trends, social issues in ways that maybe move the needle slightly. But then there are films like 300 which reflect issues where the needle certainly needs to be moved. And that does bring me on to a question for Konstantinos, just building on what Lee has said there about 300 and about the racist representation of the other, of the enemy, the barbarian in quotes. There are several places in your edited volume where you and other contributors note the very Western lens of many of the films that we've been discussing and the problematic representation of the other, of different ethnic groups. And I wonder if you can just tell us a little bit more about this and reflect on the cultural stereotyping and the racist representation that we find in some of these films, and whether that is changing for the better, and whether we actually feel like that's something in the past or something that's still problematic today.
I would like to emphasize the role of geography in mainstream cinema's definition of otherness. Mainstream cinema defines ethnic otherness through geographical dichotomies, such as West versus East or North versus South, precisely because these binaries still make sense to the modern viewer. They are immediately legible to modern audiences. For example, in the 1914 Italian silent film Cabiria, the Mediterranean functions as a symbolic boundary separating two polar opposite worlds: the noble, upright, and supposedly superior Romans from the bloodthirsty, depraved, and inferior Carthaginians. In the context of Italy's recent conquest of Libya, just 2 years before the film's release, contemporary Italian viewers could easily identify with this type of representation. Similarly, in the 1962 historical epic, The 300 Spartans, the Aegean Sea becomes a dividing line, reminiscent of the Iron Curtain that separates the unified Greek city-states on the one hand, which are implicitly aligned with the NATO, from the Persians, who are coded as the Eastern Bloc. In the 2006 revival of the Battle of Thermopylae, a film that Lee hates so much, this opposition is intensified. Ethnic difference is anachronistically translated into racialized stereotypes. And the Eastern enemy, the Persians, are depicted not only as a cultural other, but also as racially other. What I'm trying to say is that we see different types, different definitions of otherness in films revolving around warfare. In classical antiquity, skin color was one of the several markers of otherness. Language, religion, and social customs were equally important. On the big screen, the ancient world, especially the Roman world, is often portrayed as religiously diverse, and many films stage a tension between Roman polytheism and Christian monotheism, a faith to which the film's heroes ultimately convert. In this case, we see another type of dichotomy, center versus periphery. A religion originating from the empire's eastern provinces is represented as a force capable of displacing the dominant belief system of the imperial center. And of course, here there's another stereotype that the Christians are always portrayed as ethical, whereas the Romans are always portrayed as immoral. And in more recent films, this geographical polarity is reconfigured in more explicit ethnic terms. For example, Centurion, released in 2010, is set entirely in Britain and depicts Roman encounters with the Picts and other indigenous tribes almost exclusively through military violence. These groups, these non-Roman groups, are represented as barbaric, primitive, and savage, reinforcing a familiar dichotomy between the civilized Roman conquerors and the uncivilized tribes at the margins of the empire. Although the setting of the film changes for the first time, we don't have a film whose action is situated in the Italian peninsula, but in Britain, the underlying logic remains the same. Spatial, geographical, and cultural differences are simplified into moral and ethnic oppositions in order to guide audience sympathy. This has been a common pattern in cinema all along, and I think it will continue to inform the revival of the ancient world on the big screen, because such polarities, such dichotomies make sense to the modern viewer.
Thank you. And I guess that brings us back to the dynamics of storytelling and the way in which stories do reach for a certain amount of simplicity, clarity, the way in which they land with an audience correlates directly to the box office success, and that then, as you've just identified, can feed into a perpetuation of stereotypes, not just simplifications, which have profound impacts, of course. And I guess that brings me to a final couple of questions. A key focus of the Visualising War and Peace project is the world-shaping nature of war and peace storytelling, the way in which representations of conflict don't just reflect past or present realities, but actually help to shape the future by influencing how we think and how we feel and how we behave. And that leads me to ask, what ideas or idealizations of ancient warfare do the films which we're consuming promote in ways that might actually lead to real-world impacts?
Mainstream cinema presents a highly stylized and select vision of warfare. War is heroic, noble, full of testosterone, visually spectacular, and therefore entertaining. Armies are led by exceptional individuals. Battles are of specific duration, that is, cinematic duration. They're never portrayed as the prolonged and often chaotic enterprises they were in antiquity. Even when films emphasize the brutality of warfare, violence is almost always aestheticized, choreographed, and made meaningful through narrative closure. Another trend we see in mainstream cinema is the inevitability of warfare. Armed conflict is portrayed as a necessary, natural practice, as an inescapable reality that not only shaped the ancient world, but also contributed to its perceived grandeur. War was not incidental or symptomatic, but a necessary condition in order for Greece and Rome to become great. So mainstream cinema normalizes war in the past and hence legitimizes militarism in the present. Ticket buyers are not only entertained by battle scenes and feel they got the money's worth at the end of the film, they're also lured to believe that war is the method for achieving national greatness. Ancient wars on screen are usually presented as conflicts between clearly defined sides: civilized versus barbaric, free versus despotic, West versus East. Audiences are encouraged to identify with one group because this is how we operate as societies. We think in terms of us versus others. However, this mentality, this approach to the past, simplifies, not to say oversimplifies, the political, economic, and human consequences of warfare and transforms war into a morally legible spectacle rather than a complex social phenomenon that it was in antiquity.
Thank you. And that's a really important point, that illusion of moral clarity, moral simplicity, that papers over the complexity, the moral complexity, and, as you say, the politically conditioned nature of conflict and its contingent nature. You've really put your finger on this stylized, idealized representation that is inherently militarizing in many ways. Lee, I don't know if you want to add to that, but as well as perhaps adding to it, it would be interesting to hear how you see the representation of ancient warfare on film perhaps changing in the future. Are there things you would like to see more or less of, bearing in mind what we've just said about how, even as we watch them to be entertained, war films set in the ancient world and in the modern can socialize us into particular habits of visualizing war and peace?
I've given this a lot of thought, and as an ancient historian, I don't often get asked to look into the future, and generally I try to avoid it. But in this case, I do have a sense of what is likely to happen, whether I like it and whether you and Konstantinos like it or not, and that is a trend we've seen before. Sword and Sandals films come and go. They occur in spurts. There was a bunch for a little while, and then there was long hiatus in America in the 70s. There was not a hiatus in Italy. And then they came back for a little while, and in the early 21st century, and they went away for a little while. And I think if Gladiator 2 hasn't killed off the genre, then I think it's possible that we will see them in the future, though it may take a little bit of time. And the trend that I see developing is how AI is going to change the representation of war in film. Because we tend to think of writing and creating these stories, as Aristotle said, you have 3 acts. And that's almost a formula. And if you watch enough films, you see this Aristotelian formula show up over and over again in these creation of these filmic stories. Then you bring in computer graphics tools, which we haven't really talked about much, but that's had a huge impact. And then Lord of the Rings, for example, and Gladiator, both in their own different ways, figured out how do you have large groups of individuals doing something without having to pay for all those extras. Not that it's cheaper to do computer graphics, it sometimes isn't, but it does make things possible. When Lord of the Rings figured out how to do a battle and actually have all the actors moving around differently on their own with their Quake program, they kind of rewrote the way we show warfare on film. And what's AI going to do is we're going to see AI extras. There's no doubt of that. That's already beginning to happen. We're going to see AI scripts. Are we going to see AI scripts, CG, direction, everything where someone has plugged in a formula and said, here's all the features of a successful sword and sandals film, make it happen, And are we going to see that? I expect we will see that. But I'm confident when I think of auteur films and when I even think of a couple of the Oscar-nominated films right now, that there will always be individual directors, there will always be individual studios, there will always be individual producers and screenwriters who are interested in not going that route. It's not limited to Christopher Nolan. There are plenty of other directors who are interested in doing that. If we were going to have sword and sandals films 5 years from now, they'll all be talking about economic collapse or economic growth or tyranny and the state and that sort of thing. So I'm optimistic, but it's tempered with realistic expectations that AI is going to make a mess and maybe make some successes too. Who knows?
Mm-hmm. And I guess one of the things that you point to there is that AI would be doing more of what actually, in a way, some of our storytelling, some of our filmmaking has done already, which is to find formulae and to roll them out. This does bring us back to how we sort of started the conversation about these ways of telling good stories. And there are formulae for those go back a very long time, as you've underlined. But as you say, that might actually make a certain number of directors and a certain number of film goers all the more keen for different, more critical, more human takes on ancient warfare on film. Lee and Konstantinos, thank you so much for a really fascinating conversation. There's so much more we could dig into. And as we've been talking, one of the things that I've been thinking about is how fascinating it would be. This might be something I actually literally go away and start doing a little bit of. It's just thinking particularly about the representation of children in ancient warfare films, because we've talked about the way in which constructions of masculinity, constructions of women, constructions of veterans help tell war stories in different ways. And then there are these characters every so often, these young children who creep into the margins of some of these films who play a really fascinating role too. So that's one area that I might go and look at a little bit more on the basis of this conversation. And I'm going to watch some of these war films again with new eyes and noticing more of the mud or the lack of mud, more of the blood or the lack of blood, particularly attuned to the ultra violence that you've drawn our attention to and these issues around moral clarity relative to moral complexity and so on. So thank you so much for giving me and our listeners a really fascinating tour through all sorts of different kinds of representations of ancient warfare on film. I've really enjoyed the conversation and I've learned a lot from it.
Thank you for having us. It was a joy to share this with you. We're both very excited about this topic, as you probably noticed.
And I will just plug Konstantinos' edited volume again, The Brill Companion to Ancient Greek and Roman Warfare on Film, published in 2023. It's well worth reading. Some really great chapters in there. Thank you also to you, our listeners, for joining us again. We have some more episodes coming up as we continue to explore different visualizations of both war and peace in different contexts, ancient and modern. I think we have an episode coming up next on NATO today and in the future. So do please keep tuning in. If you would like to support our project, please do share our podcast with others in your networks. If you'd like to join the conversation further, you can follow us on social media. Just search for Visualising War or get in touch directly by emailing us at viswar@standrews.ac.uk. Our theme music was composed by Jonathan Young. The show was mixed by Zafir Gertin. Thank you very much for listening.